Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today is Thursday, October 27th. My name is Erica Goldwater. I'm the Vice President of Marketing for Annuitas, and I want to thank you for joining us on our third annual B2B Enterprise Demand Generation Study webinar. This is our big reveal where we tell you all the results of the study that we conducted this year and compare it to previous years. I'm joined here today by Carlos Hidalgo, our CEO and Principal of Annuitas. Before we kick off the webinar, just a few housekeeping items to go over, and that is one, we will be accepting questions throughout the discussion in the webinar. Please just submit them via chat. That way we can answer them when they come up. We'd like to keep this interactive if possible. You are all muted. However, we would like to, again, keep it interactive, so answer your questions when they show up in chat. Okay, so let's get started. Welcome, Carlos, and thanks for joining today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I love talking about this stuff and love diving into the numbers and diving into respondents' feedback. And it was fascinating to me to be able to have 2 years of previous studies and be able to compare and contrast of when we started the study in 2014, how far we've come, and in some areas how far we still need to go. But overall, I thought the numbers were good, and you know, this is one of my favorite things to do as part of our role. So let's dive in.
Great. And before we dive in, can you just tell us a little bit about Annuitas and about yourself, Carlos, for those who may not know?
Sure. We're an 11-year-old firm. I started the firm 11 years ago, came out of an enterprise software marketing background myself, so very familiar with large enterprise B2B environments with complex sales processes, multiple business lines, et cetera. And we've started the organization really in that vein, is to help B2B organizations transform what they're doing from a marketing approach. Since that time, we have established our headquarters in Atlanta. We have 30-plus marketers and strategists on our team, as well as technology team members that help organizations get more from their MarTech stack, specifically marketing automation, and also on the CRM side. We're privileged to work with some of the top brands in the country and really get excited. There's a whole group of us who just get excited about how do we help organizations change and how do we drive transformation from a demand generation perspective.
Great, thanks for that. One of the things I wanted to follow up on, why another study and why focus on the enterprise? I mean, there seems to be no shortage of studies throughout the year on demand generation. So why did Annuitas choose to focus on the enterprise?
You know, a number of years ago, as we started to look through a lot of the different studies that came out, which there are a ton of great studies, so I'm not knocking any of those that are out there. What we started to find is when you went to the back and it said, here's the demographic, you saw, 14% enterprise, and then 35% mid-market, and the rest SMB. And so what we wanted to really do is say, where is the enterprise specifically, and how we define that is $250 million in revenue and above. And so where are they specifically in terms of demand generation? Because at the end of the day, an enterprise organization has more complexity, just a broader, if you're talking about international from a geographic perspective, they have those types of things to deal with, and they're not as simple as sometimes of what an SMB deals with. So we really wanted to focus in on the enterprise, and plus it also aligns to where we focus primarily as a business.
Great. Okay. So before we actually go into the study and share some of the results, I wanted to just share for our audience some of the areas in which we focused on, and I won't read them, but you can see we cover everything that relates to demand generation, from buyer persona to lead nurturing, organizational design, and I think most importantly, something that many people don't cover is measurement and key performance indicators. Did you have any other insights or wanted to share anything about the areas in which we focused on?
Well, I think this just maps to kind of our approach and how we view demand generation and all the different components that go into it. It's much more than just developing a few pieces of content and blasting it out over an email or posting it on your website. I wish we had more than 45 minutes to dive into this, because there's just a whole host of, we could probably have a webinar for each of these different categories. So this will be more high level, But what you'll find out is at the end, Erica will talk about where you can actually access the study, and we have two different versions, one where there's a little bit of commentary behind it, and then another one where it's just kind of the raw data. But this is kind of the breakdown of how we look at demand gen from an annuitas perspective.
Okay, great. And just to follow up on that, for everyone who registered for the webinar, we will be sending out a version of the study for you, and you can, of course, always listen to this via recording after the event, and if you have any questions, just let us know. Okay, so I'm going to move over to the next slide of the presentation, and we're going to share the first stat. So this one always kind of shocks me a little bit, but how effective are your demand generation programs and campaigns at achieving your primary goals? And we can all see the results. The majority of people, 69.9%, say moderately effective. So what do you make of that?
You know, it's interesting when the first year of the study, I remember when we got the numbers back, and that very effective number was 2.9%. And I remember how you and I, Erica, having a conversation saying, this can't be right. Let's go back and actually check the data. And unfortunately, it was right. So there is good news in that we're seeing incremental improvement, but still having 20% very effective. It's interesting when I talk to people and they go, hey, well, you know, we're moderately effective. This is a good thing. It's not a good thing. I don't know that anybody who wakes up and goes to their job every morning says, I really hope today I'm marginal. I really hope today I'm just moderately effective. I think we all want to be effective. We want to be very effective. And when you think about what our CEOs and our CFOs and the organization is asking from marketing today to drive revenue, to drive pipeline, to be strategic, we have to be very effective. And so the good news, as I said, is we've seen a 16% improvement over the last 3 studies. The bad news is we're still 1 in 5 saying we're very effective. The other thing that comes to mind, and we've talked about this as well, is are we measuring effectively to even understand what very effective or moderately effective are? And so when we get into the measurement, we may talk back to this slide a little bit, but I think that's really key is, do we even have a goal of what effective looks like? And when I talk to marketers a lot and I ask them, what are your goals for demand generation? They say, well, we want to generate quality leads. Well, that's an outcome. What are the goals in terms of revenue, in terms of pipeline, in terms of maximizing customer lifetime value? So I think those are the things that we have to look at when we look at a slide like this.
Right. That's a good point. And I think, we'll talk about this a little bit later too, but it always strikes me when we see this amount of people that respond that they're moderately effective. Would a sales team be compensated if they were only moderately effective? I don't think so, but in demand gen and marketing, we seem to be okay saying that we're moderately effective. Clearly we need to work on that.
That's a great point, and it's a whole other discussion track. But I also think that very point should raise the specter of should marketing and sales be on a similar comp plan, where marketing is actually being compensated for contribution to closed won revenue.
Right. Okay. Well, we'll save that one for another webinar. Okay.
There we go.
All right. Okay. So the next slide, excuse me. The next slide talks about demand generation in general, and the biggest takeaway here is obviously we are running too many campaigns. In 2016, you can see the majority of marketers at 55.8% said they ran 15 plus campaigns. And last year, the majority of marketers, 49.5%, ran 15 plus. We seem to be going the wrong way, aren't we?
Yeah, when you look at this, I've never talked to a marketer yet who says, hey, I have so much time on my hands, I don't know what to do with it. Marketers are the marketers that I speak to. I was at 2 conferences last week, and I speak to marketers, and they're just frenetic. It is like there's not enough hours in the day to do our jobs. And I actually think this is part of the problem. And when we think about demand generation purely from a buyer perspective, buyers don't buy in a start and stop fashion, especially when you're talking about buying committees, which CEBs now says in an average B2B deal, there's 6.8 unique buyers as part of that buying committee. Yet we are starting to market and trying to create demand from a tactical campaign focused. And what I mean by that is we create 1, 2, 3, or a handful of assets. We put them on our website. We blast them out on email. People who respond to that we deem as leads, or we say, hey, let's send in something else, and we'll drip, and drip and nurture are fundamentally different. And then we collect all the data from that campaign, we stop that campaign, and we go to the next one. Buyers don't buy that way. So when we think about a perpetual conversation, an ongoing dialogue, something that's sustainable, we get away from this campaign. We get away from this idea of one and done. What we do is we build a program, and it's continuous, and it aligns to the buyer. And so rather than generating campaign after campaign after campaign, that number should come down where we're generating developing perpetual programs that we're then measuring and optimizing. And so when I see this number of almost 56% saying we run 15 plus, that is alarming to me, because it just means we are exacerbating the problem, creating more work, and trying to do the same thing over and over and over and expecting different results. And that, by definition, is insanity.
So let me ask you a question. What, just in general, obviously you can't answer this for everyone, but what would an appropriate number of programs be? Do you have one program that runs throughout with many different assets? Because I think that's part of the problem. So many, we're going to talk about content marketing a little bit, but so many people there's a lot of pressure to generate content, and so you want to share that as often as you can. And so perhaps we're pushed into running campaign after campaign instead of a program, like you said.
And I think that's a good question. I think it really aligns to how many audience segments are you going after? How many different buying segments are you going after? We work with organizations, especially in the enterprise. You have so many different lines of business that may have fundamentally different buyers, or even the same role in the organization, but depending on what product or what service they're buying, they act differently and they think differently. And so I think you really have to, this just highlights the point that you have to really understand your audience, your buying segment, their roles in that process, how they interact, how they consume content. And so if you have 5 different audience segments that you need to go after, in reality you should be having 5 different perpetual programs, all with the same foundational approach of aligning people, process, content, technology, and data to that buyer. But 5 programs that are perpetual in nature that are optimized is surely better than trying to do 15 individual campaigns in a given year.
Right, right. Well, this is a perfect segue. The next slide talks about buyer personas, and I know that's something that we just touched on briefly, but the question was, which of the following do you consider when developing buyer personas? And there were several options, but I think there's some good news in this slide. Do you want to share that?
I think there is good news. I mean, the long and short of it is, a number of years ago when you would look at buyer personas, they were all created by product marketing. As a matter of fact, I was reviewing some from a company the other day, and it wasn't a buyer persona, it was a user persona, the user of their product. And so those are fundamentally different. I love the fact that 2/3 of the organizations are going out and doing secondary research into their industry to understand a day in the life of their buyer. I think we have to then look at and say sales is great, and sales has a unique view into the customer, but if we stop there, we're going to be in trouble. We have to go and listen to the voice of the customer. So going forward, what I would love to see is current customer interviews go up. I would love to see more than half of the organizations doing that, and right now 54%, I'll call that half. And then also prospect interviews. That is huge when you get to a buyer who doesn't own your product, is not a customer of yours. And it really is interesting. I would love to understand, what are they asking during these interviews? If you're not asking about buyer's journey, who's involved, the roles they play, content consumption patterns and preferences, you're really missing a huge opportunity. So yes, at the surface, this is some good news, definitely an improvement of what we've seen in the past, and I think we're going to continue to see this practice of buyer insights and buyer personas mature as time goes on.
Okay, great. And one thing to call out in regards to the prospect interviews and customer interviews, you need to be asking questions that will allow you to develop some insights from that. So not, do you love our product, or why didn't you choose us, but more of digging down a little bit further, correct?
Absolutely. It's all about a day in their life. What are their pain points, challenges? What are they trying to solve for with your product or service or offering? What pushed them into a buying process in the first place? All of these things are going to give you tremendous insight that are going to inform the content that you're going to develop to put into your demand generation program.
Great. So that's another perfect segue, because we're going to talk about content marketing next. And, understanding your buyer, content marketing is hugely important in developing content that engages the buyer. But if you don't understand what the buyer's pain points are, how will you ever create content that will speak to them? So this slide talks about the increase in spending in content marketing, which I think, as we mentioned before, so many different organizations produce studies, and again, this statistic is pretty much the same. Everybody's spending more on content marketing. But what's the problem with that? Or is there a problem with that?
Reading this one statistic makes my head hurt. I was asked last week, I was being interviewed last week at one of the conferences by a VP of content marketing, and her closing question to me was, what should marketers do differently in 2017? And my response was, stop creating more content. We are creating so much content that goes unused, that isn't heard, that falls flat. It's not valuable, it's not relevant, it's not buyer aligned. But again, we just say, hey, we didn't get heard there, we're just going to shout louder, and we're going to create a lot of loud noise, and sooner or later someone is going to hear this. And what we need to do is stop creating content and create valuable and relevant content. And so maybe in that regard, it has to increase in your specific organization. But by and large, the answer is not, let's hire more content experts and let's create more content. Unless you have, as you just stated, Erica, unless you have a very clear view of your buyer who's involved in that buying process, how they buy and what content they like and the challenges and pain points they're trying to solve for, there is no way you're going to create content that is going to resonate. It is like putting a monkey at a keyboard and hoping in time they type a sentence. It just isn't going to work. And I see this year after year after year, and we have to start to ask the question, if we're not producing value from this increased spend, how much longer will we get the increases in our budget to do this? Sooner or later, somebody's going to ask the question, why would I fund this? Because we've done it for years and we've seen little to no improvement. So yes, there is a problem with that.
Okay, well, that's a good point. So let's talk a little bit about content marketing, about what's missing. So, we talked about it doesn't speak to your buyers, and here's a perfect example. 60.2%, I cannot say this, 60.2% say the content aligns to the buyer's pain points. So that's pretty good, but let's look at the other statistic, 29.2%. Only sometimes it aligns to the buyer's pain points. So if it doesn't align to the buyer's pain points, what's the content about? Right? I mean, is that part of the problem?
That's my whole point, is the content is probably about you. The buyer's not interested in you. They will be eventually, but when they first start their buying journey, they're not interested in you. It's like walking, I've never met anybody who likes walking on a car lot and hearing the dreadful words, what do I have to do to get you into a car today? We hate that, but we do that to our prospects. Now, I love seeing 2/3 of the respondents saying, yeah, we align to pain points. The underlying question you have to ask is, whose pain point? If you have up to 7 people on a buying committee, understand that all of those people represent different roles, different functions in the organization. They are all going to be looking at this purchase differently. So are you trying to present this problem as to what you can solve for, or do you really understand what all of these different buyers' needs are, what their challenges are, what their biases are, and what they are trying to solve for as individuals? If you don't, well then you're probably going to only be able to message to 1 or 2 people on that committee and not get very far beyond that.
Right, which goes to show that the next graphic is indicative of that, with only 38.1% saying they create content that speaks to every member of the buying committee.
Right. So when we think about that, we're not, if we're not messaging to everybody on the buying committee, then there is a problem. That committee, when you think about that committee, and I'll reference CEB again, they talk about, and they've done studies on, when does that committee fall apart and just settle on, well, we're not going to make a purchase. One of the reasons for that is nobody can come to a consensus on what this purchase is about. As marketers, if we can create content that help educate them and qualify and if necessary, quantify their problem, we will do a much better job of bringing that committee together around a consensus problem and then helping drive them forward.
Okay, good point. Good point. Okay, so another thing to talk about in terms of demand generation is the complexity in lead management these days. Again, we talk about, multiple buyers, the longer buyer's journey, buying committees. Let's talk about how people score leads these days. Is this good news or is this bad news? Score and behavioral activity are the majority of people, 59.3%. Is that the right thing to be scoring on?
I think it's a yes and a no. And we're in the political season, so I can kind of straddle that fence. I am a little worried about the almost 12% who don't score leads at all, which tells me they're probably looking at people who fill out a form and just passing them off to sales as leads. When we think about behavioral activity and we think about demographic criteria, I do think that's important. I want to see if a buyer is engaging with me. I want to see if they keep coming back. I want to see if they're interacting with my content. I also want to make sure that they're going to be somebody I want to sell to. If they're somebody that, if I'm an enterprise only, or let's just say I only sell to the SMB, and I've got a massive enterprise who comes to my site and starts to pick around, they don't fit my demographic. They're probably not going to be a good prospect or an even worse customer for me. What's really interesting is in the middle of that graphic, that orange bar, that 43.4%, that's based on the action taken and where it corresponds to the various stages of the buying cycle. That to me is key and is really where we need to bring that behavioral aspect in. And this gets back to really understanding the buyer's journey. I should not be scoring my leads saying every white paper gets 50 points, or webinar attendance gets 75 points. What I want to know is, where are you consuming that white paper? If your first interaction with me is a very early stage, is a white paper that's been written for a very early stage engagement, I'm going to score that lower. If you are continuing that journey and you consume a white paper that's designed for late stage nurture, that should be scored much higher, because it tells me we're deepening the relationship you and I are having, vendor to buyer, throughout that journey, and you stayed with me. It tells me that we're having that dialogue. So the amount of information that you're consuming and where you're consuming it is vitally important. And I would really stress to organizations, this is where they need to put a lot of their focus, but you can't do that until you know how your buyers buy and the journey they take to get there.
Okay. So, based on that, would you expect next year or in future years, where do you think that this area should change the most, the complexity in lead management, and where people should focus on? Is it that based on activity taken and where it corresponds into this various stages, or are more people with the rise of account-based marketing, are they going to be scoring on that more? The engagement channel, is there an area?
I think with the wave of ABM, I think people are going to be trying to score around that, which I don't necessarily disagree with, but I don't think it should come at the abandonment of other key criteria. Where is that account? Where are people in that account engaging and consuming content? And again, I go back to, and I know I sound like a broken record, but I go back to, if I can understand the journey my buyers are taking to get to that point, I'm going to have a very clear picture then of where I should put that content, what content I should design, and what stage my content should be written for, and then I can score against that. And so I think that's where a lot of that focus needs to be. When I see almost 60% talking about score and behavioral activity, well, does it tell me anything if I keep coming back to your website but don't consume your content? It just means I keep coming back to your website. So I could, the way I've seen score models work, I could get a lot of points for hitting your website every day. Still doesn't mean I'm interested, doesn't even mean I'm in a buying process.
Okay. Great.
So just one comment before we go on, real quick, Erica. Anybody who does have questions, feel free. I know there's that questions tab. I always find that it's easier to talk to a slide if you have a question there than try to wait to the end and go, hey, on slide 4. So please feel free to fire your questions and we'll answer it as we go through.
Exactly, and I also wanted to apologize for the quickness of these slides. This is a very new Mac, and she's very jumpy, so it's very delicate to the touch. So I sort of skipped ahead to the organizational design, which is the next slide. And you know, when we were writing these slides, it kind of feels like organized chaos in this area. How many people in marketing organizations are focused on demand generation? Again, this is obviously an enterprise-focused study, but 40%. Say 20 plus people. Is that a lot? That's shocking to me. I didn't think it would be that many.
Well, what we find is sometimes, you know, in these enterprise organizations, you'll have these alignments across different business units where there are people in whether they're field marketing roles or campaign managers where their job is to do demand generation for that specific BU. So I'm not totally taken back by the 20. What I would love to see is organizations start to move to creating these centers of excellence, these demand generation centers and specific functions, and literally demand generation departments that are responsible for addressing the needs across their enterprise and really understanding the buyer. This is not a part-time job. This is a full-time job that we are asking people to do. And when you fracture an organization and bifurcate it based on, well, you're responsible for email demand gen and social demand gen, and you're the one who's responsible for events, we start to really chop it up, and it leaves us in an impossible situation to have a continuity of conversation.
Right. And so I guess, you know, in talking about that and looking at the sheer numbers of marketers that are focused on demand generation, you know, this next question is close to my heart in terms of formal training and marketing enablement. I mean, if we have this many people focused on demand gen, it's such a critical role, but 40% don't have any training, and then some not yet, but they're planning to. So more than 50% say really there's no planning or ongoing training. So how are marketers learning the skills they need to have?
Well, when only 1 in 5 are successful, I would say they're not, which is you know, really troubling from a professional standpoint. Most of the marketers I talk to say, hey, I go to conferences, I read blogs. They're kind of self-taught in many regards. And when you look at the Forrester stat, it's 96% of CMOs are saying, hey, we're being asked to do things we've never had to do before. Well, how do we expect to get those things accomplished when we're not equipping people and providing skill set? I also think there's a severe lack of shortage of actually really good training programs on how do I do demand generation the right way? How do I structure this? I get this all the time when I speak is, hey, you told us a lot what we need to do, but you don't know how. And obviously in a 45-minute presentation to get into the how is really difficult. But we need more training programs out there. We need CMOs to set aside part of their budget to equip their people to do this well, because this is really one of the key generators of revenue for an organization. And if they're not investing in that, not equipping their people, they're just not being fair to their organization to require more, but say, I'm not going to train you on how to do it.
Right. Well, that's a good point. We actually got a question that just came in, and it was it's when it comes to organizations supporting marketing enablement for their teams, and what areas are marketers failing the most? So in other words, you know, where do they need the most help? Is it in producing great content, keeping up with technology? Where do we need to focus?
You know, I think, and again, I'm just going based on the experience and discussions that I have with marketers, it's really gaining that deep buyer insight and aligning content to that. I had many conversations in the last week being at these events where people were saying, you know, we're being asked to, or we're using personas, but they were developed by product management or product marketing. We're using content, but it's created by corporate marketing. How do we go about understanding developing the process to really gain deep buyer insights so that we can do these things, and then how do we align content in a perpetual fashion. And I think that's one of the key areas that organizations are lacking. And then the second one is analytics. I think there's a lot of powerful tools out there, but if you don't, you can pull the numbers, but if you don't understand what the numbers mean, they're just numbers. And so we really have to gear up and get better at deciphering and pulling the business intelligence out of our analytics so that we can optimize and get better in the future.
Okay, that's great. That's a good segue actually, because the next section is marketing technology, and analytics is certainly one of those resources that we use and platforms that people use more and more. I guess, when we put these slides together, it seems to me that one of the most obvious things that we need to talk about in terms of marketing and demand gen is marketing automation and our CRM systems. So that's kind of it's well adopted now. But it looks like really only 31% of people are using marketing automation one way to CRM. So it's not fully integrated.
Yeah, 45 or 46%, if you want to round up, are saying, yeah, it is bidirectional. What we have to understand is we have to be able to have that two-way link so we can constantly keep that information and update it. If it's one way, automation of CRM, we're just pushing that data through. Well, what happens when sales has that conversation and it covers somebody else who's part of that buying committee or updates some information? As marketers, we want to have that information passed back to our system. So I do think it's interesting. I still think regardless of the integration points, we have to ask the question, are we truly using marketing automation as an email engine or a dialogue engine? And we have to start looking at this as a dialogue engine and something that we should be using to create conversations with our buyers and not just using it as an email engine, regardless of how we've integrated it. Integration is kind of basic. It's something that just should be done as part of implementation. But really using it in a more sophisticated fashion is where you want to get to from a demand generation maturity standpoint.
Right, and if not, that's a very expensive email machine, correct?
Correct, yes, absolutely.
Okay, there's another slide on marketing technology. Effectiveness has increased, but how much? Really, it says 56.9% have been somewhat effective. Again, this kind of makes me feel like the skill set, sales can say we're moderately effective. Now we're moderately effective, we're somewhat effective with our marketing technology. I mean, what can we do about this?
Well, again, I think it's I think so much with technology, it's the shiny new toy. Speaking with a prospect a couple of weeks ago, they're telling me our data is a mess. We have no insight into our buyers. We've got content scattered all over the organization. We have multiple technology platforms. We don't know who's connected to what, so on and so forth. And then they end the conversation with, and we're looking at buying these two other technologies. So let's just add to the problem and pour more fuel on the fire. I think what we have to start to do, we have to take a step back and say, are we truly intending to be strategic? Marketing automation is a great tool. It can do a lot of great things, but if it's not, there's no such thing as a marketing automation strategy. It's a buyer-centric demand generation strategy. And if we can define that first and foremost, we will then be further ahead of where we want to go longer term and be able to then say, we've defined a strategy on how to engage, nurture, and convert our buyers effectively. Now, what do we need marketing automation to do? And again, when I look at we've been somewhat effective, you're spending thousands upon thousands of dollars on this technology. I can guarantee you the C-suite in your company wants more than somewhat effective as a return.
Right, I would think so. And this is something I know that everyone always is concerned about, how effective are they with their technology. So it's a good point that we often say that we want to do more, so we buy more technology, but that's not the answer, as you stated. So right. We have another slide on measurement and KPIs. I mean, I think this is really interesting too. We talked about integration and getting the most out of things, but how often do sales and marketing have a common set of KPIs that they both use to measure success? Because generally sales has one set of measurements and marketing has another set. Is that what you're seeing as well?
Yeah, and it only drives the alignment gap even further. And I've said this many times. I don't think the real issue is marketing and sales alignment at all. I think it's a symptom of a greater problem. This is one of the problems. If marketing is talking one language and sales is talking another, never the two shall meet. So what we have to really look at is say, what are some common standard KPIs that we are going to measure across that buyer's journey, across engagement, across nurturing, across conversion, and stop talking about was it sourced, influenced, and fighting over that. Those are great things to measure. But really, was marketing effective in driving qualified opportunities to sales, and sales increasing their close rate and closing more revenue with the help of marketing? And so we have to look at that and really say, so what are those metrics? What are those common KPIs? If we don't have common KPIs, the two organizations will always be worlds apart and talking completely different languages. And it's going to be hard for those two to align and almost impossible for those two to align around a common buyer.
Right. Okay. So I just wanted to let everyone know we're nearing towards the end of the time allotment, and I have 2 slides left. So if you do have any questions, please do submit them so we can address those, or certainly we can do it after the call as well, and we can answer those via email directly. The next slide is really just about a summary, kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. We talked about these for each slide, but, organizations are seeing the value in demand generation. However, as we just finished with the measurement and alignment, we still need a lot of improvement. So, Carlos, are there any areas here that, kind of jump out at you or you were surprised at, or, anything in the study in general that you need to share?
Oh, there's a lot I need to share. I really
within reason, please.
I know. No, here's the thing. I get told all the time by a couple of close confidants here in this industry that, man, you're always so negative. You're just, kind of a doomsayer, and I'm really not. I'm passionate about this. I want to see marketers improve. I know we're better than this, and I think if we just stop for a second, and if there's CMOs that are going to be listening to this, allow your people to stop and truly take the time to change and transform, because it does take time. It's not anybody who tells you they can do this in 90 days is trying to sell you something. This is not a 90-day fix. This is a complete overhaul and transformation that needs to occur in your organization. And so I do get excited when I see the percentages increase from 2.9% effectiveness to 19.5%, I believe it was. And when I see that organizations are taking steps, this is just an indication that this stuff is not an overnight. It's not simple. There are complexities that go around it, and they really, really, really have to be dedicated to it. And so I think the enablement piece is key. I think really being strategic, and first and foremost, if you're going to walk away and do anything for the rest of the day or the rest of the week, put your focus around your buyer, understanding who they are at a granular level, and really making sure you understand that, and that will really inform how you align your people, your content, your technology, and your data.
Okay. Well, just to follow up on that, we were at Marketing Profs B2B Forum last week in Boston, and someone stood up during your session and asked, well, I still have to keep the lights on, so how do I do this? So if you're going to try to be more buyer-centric, you're obviously not going to pull your content or stop things. So how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, and I think especially in an enterprise where when you have multiple lines of business, rather than telling the entire organization, hey, we're going to turn the Titanic around in the parking lot, what you do is say, let's go launch a pilot. Let's go figure out, let's identify a line of business that we can prove this new model to. In the meantime, while you're developing the strategy, continue to do what you're doing, because you can't turn off the lights and put the out of order sign on for a number of weeks and months. But start to develop that strategy, and then once that's defined through those 5 pillars that we keep talking about, then you can start the implementation process and then measure this thing and compare it to, now we're more strategic versus the tactical. What numbers are producing better? And time after time, we've seen with organizations that have adopted this approach that they're closing more deals, their marketing's contribution to revenue is going up sometimes in the double digits, and that funnel conversions across all of those areas are increasing at sometimes in the double digits and far surpassing industry best practice benchmarks.
That's great. Okay, good. And so then again, just to kind of circle back, where do marketers need to focus? We believe it's strategy, training, and measurement. So out of all of these, will one make a difference? Do you have to do all of them? I mean, we talked just now about a pilot, but where to start?
Yeah, again, not to beat a dead horse, I think you start with your buyer. Even if you don't feel comfortable doing it, just start. Go on our blog. I think we have a list of questions in one of the blogs that says, what pushed you in a purchase process? What content do you like to consume? What are you trying to solve for? Who else is on the buying committee? If you can uncover those 4 questions around your buyers, you're going to be far further ahead than your competition.
That's great. Okay, so I haven't received any other questions via chat, and we are almost to the end of our time. So last call, attendees, if you want to hear us answer any questions live, or you can, again, feel free to email us after the event. But if there aren't any more questions, we just thank you for joining us today, and you will all receive a copy of this study. But if you have any other questions, here's the link to the landing page that will give you some options as well. Carlos's email, my email. Feel free to email us anytime, ask questions. We're very active on Twitter, both of us, as well as from the Annuitas handle, so feel free to reach out to us with questions or comments. Anything before we close, Carlos?
No, I want to thank everybody who attended, and I appreciate this. And again, if you do have follow-up questions, just one-on-one, I will look for your email. And again, thank you for the time. I know time is precious, and so really appreciate the opportunity to present this to you and have this dialogue.
Great, and thank you all, and especially thanks to all the enterprise marketers that filled out the survey and gave us the insight and the data we needed to compile the study for the 3rd year. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye.